as the title implies, really what I'm hoping to do today is just show some highlights from some of the work we've been doing, trying to get at how we might address some of the challenges facing forests in the region. But to start off, really, I think it's worth just talking a little bit about why we even are doing forest adaptation, and both why we're concerned about changes in the forest, but also importantly, why are we actively engaging in management strategies that are trying to address those issues across the landscape. So to give us some context, I just chose to show one of many different polls that look at how people are viewing the future of the forest and what some of the biggest threats are to the region. And so what you're looking at here are the results of a recent survey that the Northern Forest Center did of foresters and other partners across the Northern Forest region. Many of you are familiar with what I'm referring to there, but that's Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and the Adirondack region of New York, and really asking what are some of the greatest threats to the future of the Northern Forest. And so it shouldn't be surprising, and really what I'll focus on today are kind of the threats that invasive species, both invasive insects and diseases, but also invasive plants, some of the work that Bethany does, that really threaten kind of the future of our forests, as well as the impact of climate change. But as we work our way down that list, we noticed that, we move from kind of the challenges that many of us think of in terms of what's impacting how the forest might look in the future, and really get into some pretty significant shifts that are happening in the region as it relates to how the public perceives active management, in particular, the notion of whether or not we should actually be managing forests in our region, and what that might mean, both in terms of global equity issues, where we get our wood from, but also how that influences if we can or cannot do active management as it relates to adaptation. So I thought it'd be worth, before digging into like active management and thinking about forest adaptation, just to reflect a little bit on where we're at in the situation here as it relates to forest adaptation, and do we need to actually do something as it relates to kind of actively managing in ways that can possibly enhance the adaptive capacity of forests into the future. And so, as many know that work in the region, and this is certainly not just unique to the Northeast, but what began here is that there really is become this dichotomy of, whether we should not do any management in our backyard, but still use woods. So there's going to be management happening somewhere, always a key thing to remember there. Or should we actually be doing things and have more of a hands-on, engaged approach with our forests in different ways? And I think most of us recognize really we need both. We both need both areas that we don't do management, and we need areas where we are doing management. And there's many both ecological, social, economic, and again, kind of global equity reasons for that. And there's been kind of a long-term kind of vision for this region to think about both kind of wildlands and woodlands, areas that are being protected. And there's just been a recent report on the need for more wildlands in New England. But what we're finding more and more is that there's this shift from some that we should be kind of wildlands and wildlands. And part of what's also creeping into this discussion is that we don't need to do anything in the forest for it to adapt. It'll adapt fine on its own. And I would argue that that's a correct assertion. Forests will kind of do amazing things and recombine and become kind of future assemblages of vegetation. Might be a mix of buckthorn, mix of garlic mustard, a few kind of native tree species here and there, but it will be forest in the future. But what we're really thinking about with adaptation is that we have kind of human expectations from forests that we're trying to sustain in the near term that may not always be achieved through deliberately kind of saying we're no longer going to be managing areas across the landscape. And so when we think about this notion of forests kind of assembling and responding to climate, oftentimes we'll look at this image on the right is of kind of the change in kind of oak abundance following glaciation. And many of us have seen these diagrams and thought about how forests have reassembled following glaciation. And I would argue, an important part of that reassembly wasn't just kind of natural migration, but also humans moving those species around, particularly indigenous people. But what we're facing now, as all of us recognize, is a much more rapid change in climate than what occurred, 10,000 years ago, and many other threats that are really affecting our ability to sustain the key values that forests provide in the near term. And just to underscore that, as you saw on that list of biggest threats for the northern forest, and the top on that list was invasive species. And some recent work that kind of summarized just the levels of mortality that we're seeing across areas that have been invaded by non-native invasive insects and diseases really is striking when we think about just what that means in terms of the ability of our forests to both store carbon as well as kind of support large, big trees into the future. So these figures on the left are from a great recent paper by Fay and others at a Purdue, where they looked at both how long, in the top we have emerald ash borer, in the bottom we have hemlock woolly adelgid, so how long that's been in an area, and then the annual mortality rates of trees in those areas in terms of biomass as it relates to invasion. And what they've generally found is that in these areas where we have invasion by these insects, on average, we're losing, if we combine both these two species combined, up to 2 teragrams of carbon per year. And so if we think of 2 teragrams per carbon per year, I know not everyone thinks about teragrams per carbon, but this is the equivalent to basically losing the offset for 1.6 million cars emissions in a single year. And so, yes, the forest will be fine on its own. We'll reassemble into different configurations, but if we want to sustain some of those values in terms of having trees out there that can kind of get large, fix carbon, and kind of offset some of our other issues, intervening, doing some management might make sense in certain situations. And then finally, I think, we just don't always reflect on just how much we expect the forest to be a certain way, whether it's in terms of the large trees we see when we're looking out across a landscape, recreating. We have certain ethical responsibilities to sustain certain species across the landscape as part of the agencies we work for, or just kind of broadly as part of our ethical obligation to the land. There are cultural values that come from ecosystems that without some intervention in certain situations, we may not be able to sustain in the future. And so I'll be talking about forest adaptation and active intervention for forest adaptation. And a lot of that is guided by the fact that there are certain values that we expect from forests. And so the goal with adaptation is to try to sustain those into the future, even if they might be different, still sustain those in a way that are meeting some of our societal needs and really meeting some of our expectations of ecosystems going forward. So what I'm going to get into really are talking about different projects where we're doing actions on the ground that have been co-produced with managers, really to meet some desired goals as it relates to future forest conditions, certain species being supported, certain values being supported. And so what I'm going to first talk a little bit about is just kind of the main thrust of how we think about managing for the future. And when we're doing kind of active forest adaptation, what the end goal is. And really it is kind of keeping that forest within a realm of outcomes that really are meeting both the values we have, but also sustaining the species and processes that we are charged with sustaining in a given landscape. And so to start, the first thing I want to talk a little bit about is just this notion of complexity of the forest. What do we have in terms of the different species, the different structures? Because you're going to see throughout the presentation the word complexity is going to pop up a lot. And why do we think about that when it comes to forest adaptation? And so we're looking at 2 different diagrams here on the left and right. And so on the left, we're really referring to a forest that's highly simplified. So think of a lot of our second growth forests, high deer browse pressure, simplified by past land use. And on the right, we're talking about a more complex forest, one that's either been actively managed or kind of naturally has quite a bit of complexity in it. So the graphs have kind of 2 axes, species composition and stand structure, two different ways we think about complexity. And what's key is that we all have a range of conditions that we view, this dark area that we view as kind of containing the desirable kind of provisioning of ecosystem goods and services that we expect from forests. So a simple forest, one that really has very little complexity, if it gets impacted by climate change, gets impacted by disturbances, the way that forest then progresses, that adaptation pathway it follows, there are very few options, just given there's not a lot of complexity in the system. And only so many of those pathways actually stay within that range of conditions that we view societally as being acceptable. It's still fixing carbon at a certain rate, still providing clean water, still providing habitat for our species of interest at acceptable values. The opposite is the case for complex forests. So we have the same kind of starting condition, but it's a complex stand. When those are impacted by climate, impacted by disturbance, there are many different ways that forests can then respond to that event or respond to that stressor and still stay within the acceptable bounds of what we want from that ecosystem. And so when we're thinking about active management and doing adaptation, a lot of what we're trying to do is increase that complexity and importantly, increase the number of adaptation pathways that forest has that still stay within the range of conditions that we view as desirable for that forest. And I know I'm interjecting kind of the human perspective, but that's often really what's guiding so much of what we're doing in these landscapes, including our expectations for different species and ecosystem processes. beyond thinking about complexity and structure in species kind of broadly, we also have situations that really threaten individual species in a given stand. And so when we're looking at the impact of emerald ash borer, hemlock woolly delegate, beech leaf disease, name the next invasive insect or disease that's going to affect our forests, we're often faced with a scenario where a given species that we value might be completely lost or at least functionally eliminated, maybe relegated to the chestnut sprouts or what we see now in a lot of our eastern forests. And so through the lens of adaptation, a lot of what we're looking at and what you'll see throughout the presentation when we get into thinking about how we're managing for certain species is that we move away from just focusing specifically on the identity of a given species and more focusing in on what are the values and functions that species provides, and can I do things to try to increase the redundancy of those values and functions in that forest, such that if one species is gone, I'm still sustaining those values into the future. And so in a simple kind of cartoony example, we have a mixed wood forest here, so one deciduous tree species, one conifer species. So if we lose conifer species from this forest, we've essentially lost that function. There's really no redundancy with that function in that ecosystem. On the flip side, we have a forest here that's also composed of deciduous species and coniferous species, but there are multiple conifer species, multiple deciduous species. One goes away, we still have some redundancy with that function and can still sustain it into the future. Those that are following the Bruins news, Bergeron's not skating again tonight, and so I'm happy the Bruins lineup has some redundancy at the center position. There's no replacement for Bergeron, but hopefully Pavel Zacha can fill in. So similar with the hockey roster as the forest, but the forest is a lot more complicated, as we all know. All right, so the last part of this is if we're trying to choose certain species, really we are evaluating them less on identity, although there are certainly cultural values tied to a specific species identity that we can't replace. But when we look at it from an ecological function standpoint, or look at it through the lens of how they might do in the future, we're actually managing forests and trying to encourage species that both can kind of have redundancy across different ecological functions, if possible, share some similar cultural values with a species that might be lost. And importantly, we're not just talking about loss due to insects and diseases, we're also concerned about changing climate. And so are these species that we're favoring adapted to future climate? Are they even present in the forest that I'm standing in? And if they aren't, might we actually need to start doing things that are really less common in Northeastern forests, but obviously common many other places, and that is possibly plant different species, something I'll talk quite a bit about when we get into the different experiments. So the title of the talk really should be, what has the climate change response framework done for me and for you? And so when I'm talking about localizing adaptation, a lot of what I'm really speaking to is the amazing framework that was established in 2009 by the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science that many of you have been exposed to, have been through, has been part of these workshops and these trainings, where really it's a framework that takes kind of where you're standing in the landscape and it thinks about it, in the context of those local ecological conditions, your desired conditions for that forest as it relates to your objectives and goals, but also integrates kind of an understanding of the impacts of climate change and those vulnerabilities as a way to really think through, if I'm to manage actively into the future for adaptation, what are some of the ways I might do that, and how does that still sustain those values that we do have for these ecosystems, and both in the near term and the long term. The forest might be fine on its own over the next 3 centuries, but over the next 20 years, we have some values and objectives that we need to sustain. How am I going to do that with different tools and tactics? And so besides kind of showing the great tools that the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science has to develop with different and diverse partners, including NECASC and GlyphWick, I also show something just to remind everyone that localizing things to the site and localizing things to where you're at is not a new concept as it relates to forest management. Bill Leak and many others, certainly many indigenous stewards of the land also have always ascribed to kind of managing with the site and understanding kind of how to do that. So this localization is not a new thing in terms of management and stewardship, but really what is new is kind of localizing this adaptation piece and thinking about how we do that on the ground. So what I'm going to highlight are kind of some case studies from where we've actually taken in partnership with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science this framework and applied it in an experimental setting to really allow us to not only kind of follow this template of localizing adaptation, but also do it in a way that allows us to ask scientific questions and try to address some of these knowledge gaps around what might be the best way to manage certain forests into the future, given these threats. So what we've been able to do through partnerships again and through funding via the NECASC and other agencies is really establish a series of large-scale experiments. I'm showing kind of the ones in Vermont and New Hampshire. We also have some additional ones that are being planned for other parts of New Hampshire as well as in New York State, where we take the climate change response framework developed by the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, and we translate that into some experiments that really allow us to test what managers and partners at that given location are interested in evaluating as possible adaptation strategies into the future to address both the current conditions that are in that forest, address the future threats to that forest, as well as the broad suite of objectives that they have for that ecosystem. And I'll caveat this: forests are long-lived. These are certainly quite young in the eyes of a tree, but there's certainly some useful initial outcomes that I'm happy to share today to give you at least some perspective on what we're doing. And so I'll talk about 3 experiments. I'm starting in northern New Hampshire, going down to Corinth, Vermont, and then up to the Northeast Kingdom to give you a feel for just what these experiments look like and what we're learning from localizing this adaptation and how that's playing out across the region. So the first is one that some of you are familiar with, which is the New England Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change experiment. This was designed based on the climate change response framework. So those of you that have heard about the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change experiment might not know that detail, but really it follows that playbook, for lack of a better term, of really thinking through, given the site conditions, how might we actually manage for adaptation? With the key difference being that there's a goal actually to represent kind of 4 different options of adaptation, one being control or accept, another being managing for resistance, another being managing for resilience to climate change, and the final being managing for transition to climate change. Those of you unfamiliar with this part of New England, northern New Hampshire, it's actually really productive soils for northern New Hampshire, so rich northern hardwood sites as well as mixed wood forests. It's a large landscape that's been managed by Dartmouth College for over 2 centuries. And so we were fortunate to be able to partner with them, as well as New Hampshire Fish and Game, Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation, the White Mountain National Forest, as well as different scientists to kind of come up with what these strategies might look on the ground over some fairly large scale, so about 400 acres of experimental area across the site. So what do those treatments look like? And I'll knowing this was approved for CFEs, and that most of us, including myself, think about forest management in English units. I'll show kind of a lot of today in English units. If you want me to convert to metric, I'm happy to do that in the Q&A if you'd like. But just to give you a feel for what does this look like on the ground, to manage for resisting climate change in a northern hardwood forest in northern New England. And really the goal there being to kind of minimize kind of the impact of stressors like drought, minimize the impact of ice and wind, minimize the impact of beech bark disease to really sustain that forest as it is today into the future. And so really using kind of a lighter touch silvicultural approach, single tree selection, so reducing the density of that forest, increasing resource availability to the residual trees, and importantly, when deciding what trees to leave behind, actually selecting individual trees that have kind of resistant forms to ice, resistance to beech bark disease. And so at the tree level, really selecting for resistance to try to sustain those species into the future. Moving down the spectrum here, still staying in the uneven age management realm, resilience, the goal being to increase the number of pathways by which that forest can recover back to a desired range of conditions. So still trying to keep the forest in kind of a certain range of conditions associated with today, but building in many mechanisms to recover. And so increasing the amount of gap sizes that are out there, as well as trying to recruit a diversity of species that aren't currently dominant on that site to at least increase the profile of what we might have for recovery in the future. And then at the end here, transition, still uneven aged approach, but now putting in larger gaps, still maintaining a diversity of conditions, but also planting some species that aren't currently present on the site as a way to increase kind of the representation of trees that might be better adapted for future conditions over the coming years. So one way I like to think about these experiments is that as much as I focus on vegetation and kind of how vegetation responds, there's a lot of great partnerships, at these experiments that are looking at many other organisms. Tony Lynn Morelli with the USGS and UMass and NECASC has been a great collaborator at these sites, as well as Dave King with the Forest Service, Dave Lutz with Dartmouth, Becca Rowe and Ryan Stevens and UNH, many others that have really allowed us to look at not just how forests are responding from a vegetation standpoint, but also many other species, many other processes like carbon and nutrient cycling. And so I'll speak to this later in the presentation, but it really allows us to examine not just kind of what regeneration is coming back in that forest, but what are some of the other opportunities for sustaining key processes, whether it's carbon storage or black-throated blue warbler habitat into the future. So a way to look at that complexity and think about how these different levels of management for adaptation influence the complexity, kind of those responses and adaptation pathways we have in the forest, is to kind of evaluate what's the fine scale variation in kind of overstory tree abundance as you would move through a given patch of forest that's within one of these treatment conditions. And so you're looking at pictorially above the top, going from control to transition. And on the bottom, what you're looking at is actually the frequency, so kind of the relative abundance of different levels of disturbance that's been experienced at fine scales. And so the lower the number, basically these are areas that haven't experienced any disturbance, so it's kind of an intact forest. And as the numbers get higher, these are areas that actually, trees have either fallen over, in the case of the control, or they've been removed. And so you kind of see there's going to be a higher level of disturbance severity. So as you would expect, control treatments all kind of largely unimpacted. We did have some trees blow down in some areas, and so that's kind of why we have a few spots where 50% of the area was disturbed. Moving into resistance, it's a very narrow range of disturbance, so that forest is, been harvested, but at a fairly low rate. And so kind of uniformly, you can see it in this picture here, we've kind of reduced the density of that forest, but there's not a lot of variety in resource environments or what we might have for future pathways. As we get into resilience and transition, you can see there's a tremendous range of disturbance severities from areas that were deliberately left behind as kind of patch reserves to areas that are actually gaps, like where regeneration is occurring. And so that notion of complexity and creating that range of conditions, you can see that when we look at it through the lens of just disturbance severity and kind of that fine scale mosaic that occurs within a forest stand. Another way to look at that visually is to look at kind of tree locations and stem maps. And so again, going from left to right, we go from control to transition. And what you're seeing in the bottom are just 2.5 acre areas that were stem mapped by Jess Weichel, who was an Cask Fellow as part of her dissertation work. And so you can see just by the number of dots, there's more trees as you'd expect and accept or control. As you move down this gradient, the density of trees goes down, but you also start seeing an increase in kind of the range of resource conditions and environments that are in these forests that are more towards resilience and transition. So providing more of those options for adaptation as you move your way down the spectrum. So I'll give kind of 3 case studies today, and all 3 have some case studies around tree planting. And I think that the main takeaway, if you log off from the webinar right now, is that if I'm planting trees in a given year, you shouldn't, because we've had just a lot of fun. So we're planting, actually, it's starting next week. So you might want to cancel those seedling orders if you can, if you're planting. But and the reason I bring that up is that we're adapting to climate change. We're planting trees as part of that adaptation. And we need to recognize that, even what we're experiencing in what were normal planting seasons, 2 decades ago now are pretty wacky and create some additional challenges. And so we planted this site in 2018. Here's kind of the percent of normal precipitation. So we were at about 25% normal precip. And those that remember May 2018, I know it's a while back. It was not only really dry, but extremely hot. And you can see based on the phenology, this is northern New Hampshire in mid-May. The level of leaf expansion that you're seeing in this picture is pretty advanced, relative to what would normally be that planting window. And so, as I mentioned earlier, when we're thinking about planting trees as part of these adaptation strategies, really the goal is to think about trying to both diversify the options for, response to climate, but importantly to think through how can I develop additional functional redundancy with species that are currently on the site. So an example would be, American beech, really important mast species. If that's lost to beech leaf disease, having red oak on that site in the future as a mast producing tree could be a really good function to sustain. So that'd be a simple example of that. And so on the left, these are the different species we planted at this site. And what I've done is just code these based on the type of forest assisted migration that they represent. And so the majority of them are what we would call assisted population enrichment. And what that means is that we're actually planting that tree within its current range, sometimes using a genotype from a southern seed zone, but we're really largely just increasing the representation of a tree species that's already present, possibly at small abundance in that landscape, that's expected to do better based on the projections, of climate change and associated species distribution models. 3 of these species represent what we call assisted range expansion. So if trees could actually run as fast as climate's changing, we would expect those trees to actually shift their range into the locations that we're currently at. They can't move that fast. And so what assisted range expansion is doing is actually putting those trees where we'd expect them to gain new suitable habitat just based on natural migration distances. And so for this work, we planted roughly 625 trees per species, primarily in those gap environments in the transition treatments. So this is what that looks like 2 years post-planting. Those of you trying to order different colors of pin flagging in 2018, my apologies, we definitely really sapped the market of their inventory, but what you're looking at here, each color is a different species, and we kind of randomize these across the site. So I'm going to just share some survival and growth results from this after 5 years, just to give you a feel for kind of how this has turned out. And what we're looking at here on the left is just a predicted survival probability over time, and for each of the different species that we planted. And if you look at just the overall survival rates, so 52.2%, I would lose my job immediately as a reforestation specialist if I was only batting average for survival. But you recognize that aspects of this are experimental. That's part of why we do this work. But what you'll see for all the species is that initial year was harsh, really hot, really dry. And so even the planting conditions were brutal. And so we have a pretty steep decline in survival for all species, and an even greater decline for kind of a group of species, particularly black birch, big-tooth aspen, American chestnut, and black cherry. And so there's been a group of species, particularly red spruce, red oak, and white pine, that have continued to perform quite well over time. Whereas some of the species that are more of a movement northward, and I'll talk more about this in a bit, are not doing as well, but still surviving, but certainly not doing as well across the site. Last point about this study, if we look at kind of the 5-year results in terms of survival and growth of those species, so on the upper panel, I'm showing just survival ranging from big-tooth aspen to red oak, and the bottom panel, the growth over this 5-year period. And we actually planted 3 sites, not just a second college grant, but a couple of spots in Vermont. What we see is this classic trade-off that's often observed in general between different tree species, where those species that don't survive at high rates tend to still have really rapid growth rates, and vice versa. Those that survive at really high rates, like northern red oak, tend to grow pretty slowly early on. And so collectively, if we look at kind of the overall results from this work, the top 3 kind of tiers of survival plus growth are white pine, definitely grew well and survived well, red spruce and big-tooth aspen, northern red oak, and eastern hemlock. And all of these, again, kind of represent those species that are more what we consider, population enrichment, as opposed to kind of range expansion. So I'm going to shift over the river to a different forest and a different kind of priority in terms of adaptation, and really kind of focus in on emerald ash borer and the threat that it poses to northern hardwood forests, particularly rich northern hardwood forests that often have a fairly significant component of white ash within them. And so what we're going to talk about is a spot here in Corinth, Vermont, which is another property owned by Dartmouth College and managed by Dartmouth College Woodlands. And those of you that know kind of the story of emerald ash borer and its spread throughout northern New England, it's been a little bit slower. There's a lot of areas that are just beginning to see the impacts. In Vermont, for a while, they were surrounded by states and provinces with EAB, and we didn't have it yet in Vermont. And there's kind of this brief moment of saying, "Wow, is Vermont exceptionalism going to keep EAB out?" But unfortunately, insects don't listen to our inflated sense of self-importance here in Vermont. And so what happened was EAB was first detected just over the ridge from this location. This was the first spot that EAB was found in Vermont. And Dartmouth College, knowing kind of the proportion of that forest that was ash, over 40% of that forest was ash, we had some conversations about possibly setting up an experiment to really look at, can we kind of adaptively manage in response to this, use this as an opportunity to experiment and test different strategies. And so in 2019, in partnership with Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation, Vermont Fish and Wildlife, Vermont Land Trust, and Red Start Forestry, established this experiment that's testing really 3 strategies for dealing with emerald ash borer. One is just to just observe what happens, so control, no management. One is to do what was occurring in some areas, which was just to go out and cut all the ash, kind of exploitive cutting. So I'm not saying that's a recommended strategy, but it was happening. So we wanted to test that. Then the third being this adaptive approach. So kind of actually thinking through how do we co-produce an adaptive strategy in response to this. And that's what I'm going to focus primarily on. And so with all of these experiments, there's a range of desired conditions that are guiding this. And so for the last two cases I'll show, I'll kind of highlight these. And the first desired condition that the team came up with for this site was that it's a northern hardwood forest, but it's largely single-aged, pretty dominated by sugar maple and ash without much else for diversity. And so really that first desired condition was we want to see more complexity, that buzzword again, with a goal really to provide many ways for this forest to respond both to the loss of ash potentially due to EAB, as well as other things like climate change and disturbance. So really trying to kind of accelerate structural and compositional complexity. At the same time, given understanding of climate change impacts, as well as the impact of EAB, trying to increase the diversity of species on the site, including those that might be adapted to future changes, both a forest with emerald ash borer and climate change. Thinking about just the ecosystem and some of the cultural and ecological values, and this is an area that's historically been used for gathering of culturally significant plants by the Kawasuk Band of Abenaki. And so trying to maintain those environments that support those species, and more importantly, support kind of the characteristic communities in rich northern hardwoods. Even though we're concerned about emerald ash borer, many of us still feel there's a need to try to sustain ash in the landscape. And so in areas that we're doing adaptive management, deliberately retaining ash and trying to find ways to actually recruit ash to provide future options on that site. And then finally, certainly thinking about wildlife response in particular, given just how important these forests are for breeding birds, trying to maintain and enhance that habitat. So what was designed was a single kind of adaptation strategy for this site that we're testing that again is looking at uneven age management, but so taking a forest that's largely even aged and starting to introduce kind of canopy gaps as well as areas that are being thinned in between those canopy gaps to both kind of diversify the age classes out there, diversify the species composition, provide opportunities to actually, when thinning the forest, mark for kind of high risk individuals, certainly try to leave behind. This is an ash. I can actually put on an animation here. These are all ash being deliberately retained as seed sources for the future, as well as doing things on the right here, where we're actually also planting some different tree species to try to really accelerate what's out there in terms of a diversity of climate responses. So if we look at kind of how these treatments played out in terms of just the amount of material removed, so basal area kind of being often how we look at that from the forest. These are just bar plots showing a range of kind of residual basal area. So in the controls where there was no management, still a high stocking condition, with in some cases more than half of that in ash basal area. The exploitive harvest, you can see kind of a wider range, because if you're just hunting down the ash and cutting it, you're not really thinking about any target residual basal area, so much more variability, and certainly very low amount of ash left because they're basically cutting anything that was merchantable. And then the adaptive, kind of actually doing thoughtful silviculture, you can kind of meet a more kind of narrow target, and those that know their northern hardwood silviculture know this is hitting a pretty good mark in terms of residual standing conditions, including sustaining ash as part of that composition. So looking at just comparing that exploitive, so just cutting the ash fairly blindly versus doing more of that adaptive approach. No surprise, black bars here are ash, gray bars are other species. So in the exploitive, the majority of what was removed was ash, although they had to remove some other species to get at that ash in some cases, whereas the adaptive really is kind of working across that site and trying to both create gaps, remove some ash, but also sustain that ash across that forest. So you're wondering, how could anyone plant after 2018? And I guess, I'd forgotten by 2021. And so part of this experiment is planting. And I thought, well, let's just, we learned our lesson from 2018. Spring came a month early in 2018. So we're going to get our seedlings as early as possible in 2021. And we did. We asked all the suppliers that we could get the seedlings from, like we want them as quick as possible. And those that remember 2021, actually the second earliest ice out date in Vermont was 2021. So very, very early spring. Spring came, really April 1, And we were out planting, and this is what we were dealing with again in terms of kind of temperatures. So if you look at just above, average, what we were dealing with in Vermont during that time period. So again, very, very wacky time to be planting, but we were ready. At least we had adapted by having our seedlings, and we clearly had sacrificed enough seedlings to the weather gods in 2018 that they shined some rain on us for a very key period. And so even though the rest of the Northeast during 2021, over really much of April into May, was in a drought, this portion of Vermont and other parts of New Hampshire and in Vermont received pretty good amounts of rain that were pretty critical, I think, for what we've seen on this site in terms of survival. And so, as we all recognize, with these changes in what we're dealing with from a spring, winter, summer conditions, in many cases we have to expect some of these really key extreme events are going to either make or break our success with some of these approaches. So this study is much newer, but what we've been seeing already is the survival is way above what we are observing for many of our species after 2 years in the second college grant. So the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change experiment. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, certainly this is a really nice, rich northern hardwood site, so it's a great place for a tree to be transplanted and grown, but also having that wet condition and being ready to get those trees out there at the right time, I think had a big impact as well. The 6 species we're planting there are all hardwood species. We're trying to maintain the function of that hardwood forest. And 4 of these species, basswood, red oak, black cherry, and bitternut hickory, are all in that landscape. So it would be examples of assisted population enrichment, whereas American chestnut and black birch are just to the south. And so really high survival, above 95% for some of these tree species. And in particular, those species that are kind of locally found are already doing much better than those that are a bit more of a movement northward. Just pictorially, if we look at kind of the outcomes there, so going from kind of pre-treatment to post, we've kind of increased that range of complexity, diversity of resource environments, pathways for response. Certainly by planting, we've increased the representation on that site, the future climate and EAB adapted species. And importantly, we've maintained options on that site for ash, so instead of just cutting blindly, or instead of actually EAB moving through there and creating small gaps that ash can't recruit in, the adaptive treatment really was designed to both retain mature ash, but also create gaps that could recruit new ash. So kind of this combination of options on that site. All right, so the last one will be brief and a bit different, and will get us into the lowlands of the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont, looking at a very different scenario. And so now we're talking spruce fir and forests that were really quite homogeneous relative to even the other 2 forests that we're talking about. So again, I recognize many of you are familiar with your geography, but we're in the Nulhegan Basin portion of the Silviculture Refuge. And those that know the history of this landscape, prior to the late 90s, when the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service purchased this, it was managed as part of industrial timberland for pulp and paper production. And so highly homogenized, primarily in the name of maximizing conifer production, and in particular, in some areas, maximizing balsam fir production. And so really homogenized towards a single species. And also, in some cases, you can see these pictures here on a single spacing. So these are all areas that were pre-commercially thinned and really created quite a bit of homogeneity in that landscape. And so in 2020, we were fortunate to partner and continue to be fortunate to partner with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to establish an experiment over 500 acres on the refuge to try to think about how do we create more options for adaptation and, importantly, for the species on the site. So again, just briefly, desired future conditions. First and foremost, improve habitat for the focal species on that refuge, like Bernian warbler, Canada warbler, and rusty blackbird. Second, here comes that word complexity again, given you can see in the background of this slide, a very homogeneous forest, not great for wildlife diversity and certainly not great for adaptation potential, trying to increase that complexity into the future. Given the historic loss of many species from that landscape, trying to actually restore species diversity. So I often view this as restoration for adaptation. So bringing back species like red spruce, white pine, northern white cedar, and hemlock that both were historically important, but also are predicted to do well under future climate change. And then, as one would imagine, given both its vulnerability to climate change, as well as the fact that it outnumbers any other tree 99-1, I'm in this forest trying to reduce the preponderance of balsam fir. So the 2 types of treatments that we're testing really are 2 different ways to try to introduce heterogeneity, one kind of fine scale heterogeneity using what we call variable density thinning. And I'll show a diagram of this in a moment, but really trying to kind of introduce a fine scale mosaic of gaps and thinned areas and untreated areas to create a lot of fine scale complexity in both composition and structure. And then similar approach, but using kind of more of a patch clear cutting approach where, we have 3-acre patch clear cuts within each 15-acre treatment. Within those clear cuts, retaining trees with the distinct intent of those ultimately being blown down to provide habitat for Canada warbler and other species, but trying to kind of emulate what you'd see with a mesoscale downburst from wind. And both these planting as well, and trying to increase the amount of dead wood on the site. So just to talk a little bit more about the variable density thinning, because I think this is a great practice when we think through how to introduce complexity overnight into a forest that's highly homogeneous. So again, just to remind everyone what we were starting with, this is kind of the pre-treatment condition. So when I talk about variable density thinning, I often try to use the analogy of going to someone with a very neat, well-groomed, well-kept haircut and like putting your hand into it and messing it up, right? You're trying to take something that's very, very uniform and make it very messy very quickly. And so this 15-acre area here is one of our treatment units, and you can see kind of different shades and blowouts. And so these are the gaps. And so creating these gaps to get new cohorts going, plant new trees, create kind of dense undergrowth for different species, areas where snow might accumulate at greater depths during the winter. On the flip side, having areas that are deliberately retained to give that deep shade, possibly spots during the summer that are cooler, so distinct microenvironments. And then in between those areas, actually thinning the matrix to try to accelerate tree growth, accelerate understory development. So kind of very quickly introducing this heterogeneity into what was a very uniform and highly vulnerable ecosystem. We planted this site as well. Was I pressing my luck? The answer is an emphatic yes. Last spring was another wonderful year to plant trees. So really hot, really dry, bugs in like early May, which is, people in short sleeve shirts in late April, very hot, really challenging conditions. And in the interest of time, I'll just kind of the takeaway from this work was it was not a great year to plant trees. We had a lot of challenges with survival, and the 4 species we planted, kind of overall survival was a little bit under 70%, which is not fantastic. Across those, we planted 11,000 seedlings. So part of the challenge was not only was it a tough time to plant, we were planting a lot. And so being able to move quickly and get those trees in the ground were an issue. In addition, kind of all of a sudden taking a forest that had very limited food resources to all of a sudden now having things like spruce and cedar and hemlock to nibble on certainly didn't help as well with snowshoe hare and other species that certainly we're happy with the salad bar that we introduced to that landscape. But nevertheless, we still feel hopeful with how things have carried over the winter, but definitely not as much survival on this site relative to others. And part of that is both the weather and just how many trees we were putting out. So final couple of comments on the planting before I wrap it up, and just generally what we see across all of our work. This is some work that Pete Clark summarized. In general, if we look at just overall survival, overall growth, comparing population enrichment versus range expansion, generally, higher survival for those species that are currently present, or if we're moving kind of southern genotypes of a species currently present, they tend to do better than things that are being moved in terms of their range. The one thing I will point out is that even those species that are being kind of moved still have pretty high rates of survival. So you're not going to get, gold star as a tree planter with 50% survival. But if we're thinking about adaptation and some of these species that are surviving even at low rates being really important future adaptation pathways, if you have the risk and risk opportunities to introduce these in places, I think it's a really critical piece of that portfolio of options on the landscape. The challenge, and I won't belabor this, we can have a whole other webinar on this, is that we don't have a lot of options right now to source diverse nursery stock, diverse seed zones. Right now, about 15% of the potential seed zones for most tree species are represented like in our nurseries. So if you're really trying to match, seed zones for future climate, it's quite limited. And I would put in a plug for some work that Pete McIntyre is leading around climate adapted population supplementation that looks at this both through the lens of both brook trout as well as tree seedlings, and kind of how we might kind of address this if we really are going to plant. How do we do that into the future? And so the final comment on this before I conclude is that being able to look at these large experiments and look at multiple responses, so through many multiple wildlife taxa, through carbon, through tree vegetation, we're able to really look at adaptation through different objectives and how well they're satisfied by a given approach. And I started the talk today talking about kind of the movement towards no management, and that's really being driven by maximizing carbon as an objective over anything else from our forests. And I think we all recognize that there's a whole range of objectives we're trying to sustain, and it's important to recognize that certain forests are good at maximizing one versus another. And so can we actually evaluate what conditions work well for different objectives and where those trade-offs might exist? And so thanks to people like Tony Lin and Dave King and Dave Lutz, we can speak to, what do we see for wildlife responses in an area that's not being managed, and so we certainly see high amounts of carbon, as you would expect. You see high amounts of interior mammal species like martins and black-throated blue warblers, but we also, when we observe the adaptation potential of those areas, they're actually the lowest, right? There's few species, there's not a lot of diversity, often kind of uniformity in structure and composition. On the flip side, when we look at more transition type approaches or resilience, we're creating gaps, we're planting trees. And so by doing that, we're lowering kind of the carbon storage in the near term, but we're also increasing the representation of mourning warblers and chestnut-sided warblers, and also increasing that adaptation profile. And so when we talk about hands-off or hands-on, it's really about that mosaic. We need both, and part of why we need both is that we can't satisfy every single objective to the max in any given area. We need to kind of have this balance across the landscape and do that in ways that really are integrating both, the ecosystem's needs, but also what are our expectations for the next couple of decades. So I'll end with, localizing adaptation. It's what we've been doing for a long time, but now I think it's really important that we're kind of thinking about this through the lens of, what do we want from these ecosystems in the next, 10, 20, 30 years, and what's acceptable. And I would argue that, the biggest barrier and what we see in our surveys is it's not being able to get the right seedlings, although that's certainly not an insignificant barrier. But it's really, this growing opposition to that people don't want forests to be managed, and so if we really want to engage in active stewardship and really kind of push back against that, we really need to understand that people, need to recognize why we're doing adaptation, developing partnerships that are diverse, and really engaging in understanding kind of how people value forests and how we can sustain it into the future is really important to get through that key barrier. So speaking of diverse partnerships, obviously I've done like a percentage of the work you saw today. The majority has been done by many other people, and really fortunate to have some amazing partners and certainly some amazing support through the NECASC and other sources.